The egg hit the rim of the tin bowl with a soft crack, and the yolk slid out whole. I had been watching Aldous Rene grade eggs at the Dunmore County Fair for 3 years before that morning. First as a boy standing at my grandfather's elbow, then as a boy standing alone. I knew the exact rhythm of the man, the 2-fingered grip, the clean break against the bowl's edge, the 3-second glance before he called the grade and moved to the next carton. 3 seconds, never more. He did not call the grade. The yolk sat in the center of the bowl like something that had no business being there, round and high and the color of a harvest moon on a clear October night, that deep copper orange that you don't see in a standard egg, that you don't see in most eggs at all. The albumin spread clean around it, no wateriness, no gray tinge at the edges. Rene leaned forward slightly, just an inch. A man like Rene does not lean forward. It was August 14th, 1952, a Thursday. The fairgrounds smelled of trampled grass and fry grease, and somewhere behind me, a pig was winning a ribbon it hadn't asked for. I was 18 years old. I had $9.12 in a coffee tin 5 months ago, and I had made decisions since then that more than a few men in this county thought were the decisions of a fool. One of those men was standing 3 feet to my right. He was a large man, red-faced from a summer working 200 birds in open-air runs, and he had laughed, actually laughed, a short, hard sound like a post mall striking frozen ground, the first time he saw me walking up Ridgeback Road with Vera Coombs's slop pail. He had called something across the fence. I hadn't answered. It wasn't worth answering. I had somewhere to be. Now he was looking at the bowl. The other farmers had drifted in the way farmers do at a grading table, casually, without appearing to care, which means they care enormously. There were 4 of them by the time Rene finally picked up the bowl and tilted it slightly, watching the yolk hold its dome without breaking. Someone made a low sound. Not a word, just a sound. Rene set the bowl down and looked up at me for the first time since I'd set my carton on the table. I said nothing. I had been waiting 6 months for this exact silence, the silence of a man who has already decided something and hasn't yet found the words that fit it. I had learned to read that silence in the pages of a small green journal, in my grandfather's careful hand, in a grain room that smelled of old tin and dust, and something that had been waiting a long time to be found. The morning that journal found me was as cold as any morning I could remember. The morning that journal found me was February 3rd, 1952, which was also the morning my grandfather died. He went in his sleep, in the iron-framed bed in the room off the kitchen, sometime between the 2 o'clock feeding and sunrise. I found him when I came in from the barn, with my hands still cold from breaking the ice on the water trough. The lamp was still burning low on the nightstand. He looked no different from any other morning, except that he had stopped. That was the thing about him. He had always been so completely present, so oriented toward the next task, that his stillness was the loudest thing in the room. I was 18 years old and 2 months. The county lawyer came out to Ridgeback Road that same afternoon, a Tuesday, driving a green DeSoto that looked wrong on a dirt road. He sat at the kitchen table and read me what my grandfather had left. 31 Rhode Island red-laying hens, 1 rooster, a 1941 Ford tractor that burned a quart of oil every 4 hours, and the farm itself, 12 acres, the house, the barn, the grain room, the root cellar, and a mortgage note of $214 held by the First Savings Bank of Millhaven. There was also, the lawyer noted, a coffee tin on the shelf above the stove. He didn't touch it. I opened it after he left. $9.12. That was the entire inheritance. I stood at the kitchen counter for a long time with the tin in my hands, counting the bills and coins, as if the number might change on the 3rd or 4th count. It didn't. By the end of that first week, I understood that the farm had an opinion about me, and it was not flattering. The hens laid poorly in cold weather, 14 eggs on a good day, 9 on a bad one. The tractor wouldn't turn over without 30 minutes of coaxing. The barn roof had a soft spot above the south stall that I could press with my palm and feel give. I was eating oatmeal twice a day and saving the feed costs wherever I could, which meant I was making decisions no 18-year-old should have to make, and making them alone. The neighbor to the north, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s who ran 200 hens on the adjacent property, came by on the 5th day and leaned on the fence post between our fields, in that particular way men do when they've already decided what they think. He told me I ought to consider whether I was really the right person for this. He didn't say it unkindly. He said it the way you'd tell a child that a tool is too heavy for him. Not cruel, just certain. He'd been farming Dunmore County for 30 years. I'd been doing it for 5 days. I thanked him and went back inside. The borrowed truck belonged to a man 2 farms over who owed my grandfather a favor from before I was born. It was a 1947 Dodge flatbed, gray-green, with a starter that required a particular angle of wrist on the key, a half turn, then a pause, then the rest of the way through, and if you didn't know that rhythm, it wouldn't catch. The man had explained it to me twice, slowly, like he expected me not to remember. I remembered. I loaded the eggs on a Thursday morning, the 2nd week of March, 41 dozen, in cardboard flats, stacked in the bed, and covered with a canvas tarp against the cold. 41 dozen was 11 days of gathering, minus the cracked ones, minus the one I'd eaten myself on a Sunday when the oatmeal ran low. I drove the 4 miles into Millhaven with the windows up and the heater making a smell like something electrical burning slow, and I told myself the number the whole way in. 41 dozen. At the price my grandfather had been getting, which I'd found written in pencil on the inside cover of a hardware receipt tucked into the kitchen drawer, that should have been somewhere near $22. The co-op sat on the south end of Millhaven's main block, a long cinder block building with a loading dock and a hand-lettered sign above the door that had weathered until the letters were more suggestion than fact. I backed the Dodge up to the dock the way I'd watched men do it at the county elevator when I was a boy, slow and in 2 corrections, and I carried the flats inside myself because there was no one who offered. The purchasing agent didn't look up when I came in. He was a trim man with reading glasses pushed down his nose and a clipboard with a carbon sheet under the top page. And he had the particular economy of motion of a man who had assessed 10,000 deliveries and expected this one to take 15 seconds of his attention. He lifted the corner of one flat. He pressed a single egg lightly with his thumb, turned it, set it down. He wrote something. He tore the bottom copy from the clipboard and held it out without raising his eyes. Standard grade, 38 cents a dozen. $15.58 for 11 days of work. I stood there long enough that he did finally look up. His expression was not unkind either. It was simply final, the way a door is final when it closes flush in its frame. I drove back north on Ridgeback Road with the empty flats rattling in the bed and the number working through me like cold water. $15.58. Feed costs alone were running close to 11. The mortgage note sat in the kitchen drawer like a stone. I was still doing the arithmetic when I passed the operation to my north. White buildings, everything plumb and painted, Badger Mill feed bags stacked inside an open equipment bay tall as a man. The broad-shouldered neighbor was at his fence line. He raised one hand, not quite a wave. He called out that he hoped I knew how to pour concrete, said the bank was going to need it to fill my grandfather's hole. I drove on without answering. The Dodge rattled, the empty flats shifted in the bed, and I thought about that carbon receipt folded in my coat pocket, and the $9.12 in the coffee tin at home, and the 41 hens asleep in the barn. The cold came back that last week of March, a mean, low-pressure cold that had no snow in it, just wind finding every gap in the siding. I spent a Thursday morning going around the barn with a candle, watching the flame for pull, marking the worst spots with a carpenter's pencil. Most of them I could pack with rope caulk. One of them, in the grain room on the north wall, was moving too much air to be a crack. I pulled the shelf out on Saturday morning. Flour sacks, a rusted oil can, an empty salt block wrapper. Behind the shelf, the boards were rough cut, original to the barn, and when I pressed my palm flat against the third one up, I could feel it. A slight give, the nail at the top end pulling free from old dry wood. I worked a pry bar behind it with 2 careful taps. The board swung out on the bottom nail like a hinge. The tin was sitting in the cavity like it had always known I was coming. Prince Albert, the lid said, in raised letters under a coat of dust. Someone had wrapped 2 full rounds of black electrical tape around the seam where the lid met the body. The tape had dried and gone brittle, and it cracked when I worked a thumbnail under it. Inside, wrapped in a square of oilcloth tied with kitchen string, was a small book, green leather, hand-stitched along the spine with waxed thread gone brown with age. No title on the cover. Just a name pressed into the leather in small block letters near the bottom right corner, E. Haskell. I sat down on the grain room floor with my back against the wall and opened it. The handwriting was cramped and careful, the way a man writes when he knows paper costs something. The first entry was dated April 3, 1938. The last one I could find in a quick fan of pages was from sometime in 1944, the exact date smudged where the oilcloth had pressed. Between those 2 points my grandfather had recorded, in columns and in plain sentences both, everything he had ever tried with his laying flock. Feed weights, molt timing, death counts, egg counts per week per bird, weather notes, costs per dozen to produce, what he sold and what he got for it. And in the middle section, starting in the summer of 1939 and running forward through 1943, a feed system he had worked out through trial and error, failure and revision, season by season. I brought the lantern in from the hook by the barn door. I set it on the overturned salt block and I read. The lamp burned for 2 hours before the wick started to pull low and the light went amber and thin. I did not move to refill it. I just tilted the page closer to the flame and kept reading. The journal was not what I expected. I had half imagined it as something personal, a grieving man's private thoughts, maybe, or the rambling notes of someone who'd grown lonely on a farm with no one left to talk to. It was neither of those things. It was a working document, a record kept the way an engineer keeps a record, or a doctor tracking a patient across years. Every entry had a date. Every entry had numbers. He started with the basics: feed weight per bird per day, noted in ounces, scratch grain, mash from the feed mill, the cost per pound, the date of purchase, the supplier. Those early entries from 1938 were tight and spare, a man who had not yet found what he was looking for, just measuring what he had. Then in the summer of 1939, something shifted. The entries got longer. The columns split into 2, then 3, then 4 categories across the page. He had started running variations, a portion of the flock on one regime, a portion on another. He was not guessing anymore. He was testing. The first edition was kitchen scraps, vegetable peelings mostly. Carrot tops, potato skins, the outer leaves of cabbages his wife peeled off and set aside. He weighed what he gave them. He counted the eggs the following week. In the margin, in smaller writing that angled slightly uphill the way handwriting does when a man is excited without admitting it. Yolk deeper by the 3rd week. The second edition was crushed dried eggshell, worked back into the feed in small amounts. He noted the calcium logic of it, briefly, in plain words. Then he noted the result: stronger shells on the next generation, less breakage at collection. The 3rd edition was oats, raw, soaked overnight in a clay pot, drained in the morning and mixed into the morning feed. He had tried them dry first. The birds had picked around them. Soaked, they took them without hesitation. He wrote, "They know what they need if you give them the right form of it." And once a month, in the drinking water, a capful of raw apple cider vinegar. Just one line about why, something he'd read, something a man at the Grange had mentioned. He tried it and kept it, because the birds seemed steadier through the August heat. What struck me was the patience of it. This had taken him 5 years to work out completely. 5 years of notes, of adjustments, of lines crossed out and rewritten. He had not been handed this. He had earned it, one season at a time. In the back pages, he had listed the birds by their leg band numbers, and beside each number, a name. I recognized some of them. August was in there, younger, a different bird by the same name he'd kept the tradition of. I sat with the lantern going dim around me, and understood something. I had known my grandfather as an old man. I had not known him at all as a farmer. I sat with that journal until the lantern ran out of oil, and I had to finish reading by feel, tracing the pencil lines with my fingertip in the dark. By the time I set it down on the grain room floor, my back ached from leaning, and the cold had come up through the floorboards into my knees. But I had a direction. That's the word I kept using to myself in those days. Not a plan, not a solution, a direction. The journal made it plain. The feed rotation was only half of it. The other half was the scraps. Vegetable peels, apple cores, bread heels, the outside leaves of cabbage. The things a kitchen throws away without thinking twice. My grandfather had not been buying these from anywhere. He had been receiving them from the neighbor half a mile south, the widow whose husband had died in 1948, the same woman I'd seen from the road twice in 3 years, small and deliberate in her coat, carrying something toward the fence line. I had never once wondered what she was carrying, or where it went. I walked down on a Wednesday morning in early April. The mud on Ridgeback Road had started to give a little under the sun, the kind of give that promises spring, but doesn't quite deliver. I knocked at her door, and she opened it before I'd finished the second knock, as though she'd been expecting someone to come. She looked me up and down once, not unkindly, the way a person appraises a fence post to see if it's plumb, and said she'd been setting out that slop pail since the fall of 1948, and had wondered when someone sensible would come along and use it. I told her about the journal. I told her about my grandfather's notes, about the feed rotation, about what he'd been getting from her for years without my knowing. She listened with her arms folded and her eyes steady. When I finished, she nodded once, as if something had been confirmed rather than explained. We worked it out standing on her porch with the wind coming from the northwest. She would save every vegetable peel, every apple core, every bread heel, whatever a kitchen discards. I would pick up the pail on Tuesday and Friday mornings, and every other week I would leave a dozen eggs on her porch before she was up. She said that was more than fair. She said her late husband had always paid too much for things out of pride, and she had never seen the sense in it. The first Tuesday I came, her pail was fuller than I expected. Nearly 3 gallons, tight-packed and covered with a square of cloth she'd weighted down with a stone. I carried it back up the road with the mud soft under my boots, and the morning still cool enough to see my breath. It felt like more than a trade. It felt like a handshake with someone I had never properly met, my grandfather's valley, reaching back to take my hand. The arrangement with Vera held through the rest of March and into April, and somewhere in those 6 weeks the hens changed in a way I noticed, before I could measure it. Not dramatically, nothing on this farm moved dramatically, but the shells came away cleaner in my hand when I gathered, and the birds moved differently in the yard, more deliberate, the way a well-fed animal moves when it isn't always searching. August crowed earlier. Small things, the kind a person who'd spent 3 months sleeping in this farmhouse and waking before light might catch, and nobody else would. Word travels on a county road the way water travels in a field. It finds the low places and pools there. By late April, it had found Harlan Geddes. I heard about it secondhand, the way you always do. I was at the Millhaven Feed and Grain on a Saturday morning in the last week of April, loading a 50-pound sack of raw oats onto the counter while Dale Frisch wrote up the ticket. The place had that particular Saturday morning density. 3, 4 men standing with coffee, no hurry, the smell of burlap and mineral dust and cold coming off their coats. Geddes was near the window, with 2 men I recognized by face, but not by name, and he was talking loud enough that quiet wasn't the point. He said the Haskell boy was feeding his chickens a widow's slop pail, kitchen garbage, apple peels and bread ends and God knows what else scraped off somebody's supper plate. He told it like a man who had a funny story and wanted credit for finding it funny first. The men near the window laughed. It was an easy laugh, the kind that doesn't cost anything. I set $1.20 on the counter and picked up the ticket Dale slid across to me. I did not look over at the window. I was aware of the exact location of the door, the distance between the counter and it, and I walked that distance at the speed of a person with no reason to hurry and no interest in being stopped. The oat sack was 50 pounds. I lifted it into the truck bed without setting it on the rail first, which I had been unable to do in February. I sat in the cab for a moment before I started the engine, not because I was upset, because I was doing arithmetic. $1.20 for the oats, 38 cents a dozen at standard grade, the coffee tin at home with its exact contents, the math of the next Tuesday and the Friday after that, and how many mornings it would take before the numbers changed. I couldn't spend words. I knew that the way I knew the Ford burned oil as a condition of operation, not a complaint. I started the truck and turned north onto Ridgeback Road. The third week of June came in hot and still, the kind of heat that settled into the barn boards and stayed there past midnight. I had been running the scrap rotation for 3 months by then, every Tuesday and Friday from the widow's pail, the soaked oats every Sunday evening, the vinegar in the water font on the first of each month. I had it written in pencil on the inside of the grain room door now, my own hand copying his. I had watched the hens the whole time. I watched them the way you watch a slow repair, not expecting it to be finished, just checking whether it's moving. Their combs had reddened up by April. Their feathers had a different quality by May, something denser and more settled, the way a good coat looks broken in versus just worn out. But a comb and a feather are not something you can set on a counter at the co-op. I needed the egg. The evening of the 21st, I came in from the last feeding, and there was one egg that had been cracked in the nest. One of the big Rhode Island Reds had stepped on it, pushed it up against the wood. It wasn't broken through completely. I carried it to the grain room and set it in the tin bowl I kept on the shelf there, meaning to look at it in better light. The lantern was hanging on its nail. I lit it and held the bowl underneath it. I cracked the egg the rest of the way with my thumbnail. The yolk sat up. Not the flat pale yellow I had been seeing in March, not the medium yellow of May, which I had told myself was progress, but which I had not been entirely sure about. This was something different, round and high, and a color I had to look at twice, a deep, burnished orange, the color of the sky on the far edge of a harvest moon. It held its dome. It did not spread. It sat in that bowl like it had weight. I held the bowl still. My grandfather had written the sentence on page 11 of the Green Journal, in the tight, careful hand he used when he was recording something he considered important. By June, the yolk will sit up round and orange as a harvest moon. When you see it, you will know the system is complete. I had read that sentence in March, standing in a cold grain room with $9.12 in a coffee tin and 31 hens that didn't know me yet. I had read it and thought, I will believe that when I see it. Now I was seeing it. I stood there longer than I needed to. The lantern made a small sound, the metal contracting. Outside, August crowed once for no reason, the way he sometimes did in the late evening, as though reminding the yard that he was still in charge of it. I set the bowl down carefully on the shelf. I left the bowl on the shelf and went to bed, but I didn't sleep for a while. I lay on top of the quilt and stared at the ceiling, and thought about the sentence my grandfather had written, and how long he must have waited to see the same thing I had just seen. 6 years of notes in that journal, 6 years of adjusting the soaked oats, changing the vinegar ratio in July, crossing out what didn't work, and writing the corrections smaller in the margin. He had earned that yolk. I had only followed his directions, but I had seen it, and that felt like something. By the first week of July, I had 41 dozen eggs in the cool room, and no good way to tell anyone they were different. I rode into Millhaven on a Thursday morning, 4 miles on the Ford, which ran hot on the long hill past the Geddes property and smelled of burning oil the whole way down. I parked on Clement Street and went into the Rexall drugstore, which carried a little of everything the hardware store didn't. I had seen a rubber stamp kit in the glass case near the register once before, and I had been thinking about it since June. The woman behind the counter was named Martha Spear, maybe 50, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She set the kit on the counter for me, 60 cents, which I counted out exactly. Before I picked it up, she asked what I needed it for. I said, "A label." She asked what kind. I said, "Eggs." She looked at me over the glasses. "What are you calling them?" "Haskell Gold," I said. "After the farm." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said she wouldn't mind a dozen, if I had them to spare. I said I'd bring them Tuesday. I went home and sat at the kitchen table that evening with the stamp kit and a sheet of brown wrapping paper and carved the letters myself with the small blade that came in the kit. It took 3 tries before the impression came out clean. Haskell Gold. 2 words. My grandfather's name and the color of what he had figured out, pressed into paper in plain black ink. I wrapped each carton and stamped it. Tuesday I brought a dozen to Martha Spear. She set them on the counter and cracked one into a cup, right there in the store, just to see. She didn't say much, but she told 2 people that afternoon. Those 2 people told 4. I didn't know any of that yet. I drove home on the Ford and thought about the cool room filling up, and whether 41 dozen would be enough to matter to Aldous Renee. The Dunmore County Fair opened on the morning of August 14th under a sky so flat and white it looked ironed. I had loaded the eggs before dawn, 2 dozen, the best of the week's collection, nested in a flat I'd lined with dry hay, and driven the 4 miles into Millhaven with the windows down because the Ford ran hot in summer and I had learned not to push it. The open-class produce exhibition was held in the long white tent behind the livestock barn. I had asked about entering in June, and the woman at the extension office had looked at me the way people do when they're deciding whether to be polite about something. She said the entry fee was 50 cents, and that the class hadn't been won by a first-year operation in 11 years. I paid the 50 cents. I set my flat on the table at 8:15 and stood back. There were 9 other entries, some from operations I recognized, one from a farm 2 counties over. The grading table was run by the co-op buyer himself, which I had not known when I entered. He moved down the table in his white shirt, with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, cracking 1 egg from each flat into a shallow tin bowl and holding it to the light. He did not say anything as he worked. He wrote numbers in a small ledger. He reached my flat last. He cracked the egg. I watched it fall into the bowl, the white spread clean, and the yolk, round, sitting up firm, deep orange, caught the tent light in a way that made the man next to me draw a small breath without meaning to. The buyer did not write anything for a moment. He held the bowl and looked at it. 6 feet to my left, the loudest doubter in Dunmore County was standing with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and he did not say a single word. The silence in that corner of the tent lasted maybe 15 seconds. It felt longer. I noticed I had stopped breathing. The buyer set the bowl down, made a mark in his ledger, and called the ribbon. $4 in prize money. The blue ribbon itself was a simple satin thing, the color of a clear day. I held it and felt its weight, which was almost nothing. On the way out of the tent, the buyer fell into step beside me. He didn't slow down or look over. He said it quietly, the way a man says something he's already decided. "Bring me 2 cases next Friday. I'll grade them premium." I kept walking. The fair went on around us, loud and ordinary, and I carried that sentence out into the white August light. The 2 cases went out the following Friday in the bed of the Ford, wrapped in straw and set careful. I drove the 4 miles into Millhaven with both hands on the wheel and the windows down, and the morning was still cool enough that my breath showed a little. That was August. September came in dry and golden, the way the best September mornings do in Wisconsin, and I drove over to Ashby County on a Tuesday and came back with 12 pullets in a wood crate, Rhode Island Reds the same as the others, young and loud and indignant about the whole trip, $6 even. I set them in the far corner of the coop and let August settle things in his unhurried way. The flock was 43 now. I wrote it in the back of the green journal, the same place my grandfather had kept his count, below his last entry, in my own hand. The fall went the way falls do, fast and then gone. I kept picking up the slop pail on Tuesdays and Fridays. I kept soaking the oats. First hard frost came in October, and I banked hay bales against the coop walls the way the journal said to. The hens barely noticed. By January, the co-op was grading every flat I brought in at premium, 54 cents a dozen. I wrote that number down too. February was cold and gray and ordinary, and on the 14th of that month I walked into the First Savings Bank of Millhaven and set $41 on the counter and asked them to apply it to the mortgage on Haskell Farm, Ridgeback Road. The teller wrote a receipt. I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket and drove home in the dark. March came. The snow was still on the fields, but pulling back from the fence lines. I was out early one morning, checking water, when I heard tires on the road, and looked up and saw the neighbor's truck slow and pull onto the shoulder. He got out and walked to the fence. He was 54 years old and had 200 hens, and had been buying pelleted commercial feed out of Eau Claire since before I was born. He looked at the ground for a moment before he spoke. He asked what I was putting in the feed. I went inside and came back out with the green journal. I showed him the pages, the rotation, the dates, the oats, the vinegar, the note about Vera's pail, written in my grandfather's close, careful hand. I told him where the pail sat and what day she set it out. He read the pages slowly, in the cold morning light, and did not say anything for a long time. He stood there a long time. Then he handed the journal back, nodded once, and got in his truck and drove south toward his own place without another word. I watched the truck disappear around the bend. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than that. That was March of 1953. By May, the snow was fully gone, and the grass along the fence line was coming in green and thick, and the flock was 60 hens. I had bought 29 more in February, Rhode Island Reds, same as my grandfather always kept, and banded each one and written their names in the back of a new notebook I'd started keeping. August was still loud before sunrise, still the first sound every morning, before the birds, before the wind picked up off the fields. Some things don't change because they don't need to. One evening in the second week of May, I went into the grain room and sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, in the exact spot where I'd found the loose board 2 Aprils earlier. The tobacco tin was sitting on the shelf above me now, empty and clean, lid on. I'd wiped it out with a rag the previous fall. I didn't know why I kept it up there. Maybe I just liked having it where I could see it. I opened the new notebook on my knee and wrote the date at the top of the first page. I sat there a while before I wrote anything else. What I've come to believe is this: the walls of an old barn hold more than nails and weather. They hold what a man knew and didn't have time to say out loud, or didn't think anyone would want to hear, or figured he'd explain someday when the right person came along and asked. The right person doesn't always come along while there's still time. So he puts it in a tin and seals the lid and tucks it behind a board and hopes. I was the right person. I just came 11 years late. The neighbors who laughed weren't wrong about the scraps. A bucket of potato peels and cabbage cores and eggshell is not impressive to look at. They were wrong about what scraps can become when someone takes them seriously. When someone reads the margins of a dead man's notebook in lantern light and decides to try. If you've got an old barn on your family's land, or a drawer nobody's opened in 40 years, go look. Whatever's in there was put there by someone who thought it mattered enough to save. Maybe they were right. If this story found you, Leave a comment below and tell me what you found, or what you're still looking for. And if you know someone who's been told they're too young for the work in front of them, send this their way.